Welcome to our daily Bible study. We are currently studying the book of Acts together, and today, Lord willing, we're going to be completing our study in Acts chapter 15 as we read and study together from verse 36 down to verse 41. But before we unpack that together, let's make sure that we're familiar with our passage by reading that together now. So Acts chapter 15 from verse 36. Now, after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city in which we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." And Barnabas wanted to take John, called Mark, along with them also. But Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along, who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there was such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another. And Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and left, being committed by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he was travelling through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Now, of course, this comes hot on the heels, doesn't it, after the Jerusalem Council that we've been studying over the last few days. And then following that, Paul and Barnabas travelled back to their home church in Antioch, the church that commissioned them for their first missionary journey, where they took John Mark initially as well, if you remember that, where they started off in Cyprus and then travelled to Galatia, to southern Turkey, where they were planting churches and where they were going to the synagogue first and then to the Gentile, to the Jew first, then to the Gentile, and where many people were becoming saved and there were churches being planted. But in verse 35, we were told after the Jerusalem Council, Paul and Barnabas spent a long time back in Antioch teaching and preaching and giving testimony about all that the Lord had been doing. And with many others also was teaching the word of the Lord. So now some days after this, when it had come probably to a time of the year where it was now safe to travel by boat, now after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city in which we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." Now, this is such an important concept, such an important thing for us to recognise. We have already seen this and discussed this before. When we're talking about evangelism, it isn't just a case of, a tick in a box. A success is that person visiting the church and then we leave that person, to then fend for themselves. The whole part of making disciples is to invest ourselves, to pour ourselves into those believers' lives. And this is what we see here. Paul hasn't just planted these churches and then washed his hands of them. No, he is a pastor. He has a pastor's heart and wants to go back and see how all of these churches are doing, especially knowing that there was these legalizers, these Judaizers that had gone into the churches and then started distorting the gospel. He'd already written this epistle, the epistle of the Galatians, to warn all of these churches about these false teachers. But now he wants to go back and loop back round to all of these churches to see how they are doing. Now, we see that he says to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city in which we proclaim the word of the Lord and to see how they are." But how does Barnabas react? Barnabas says, "Yep, great stuff, let's do it, but let's take John Mark with us." John Mark was commissioned to go with them in the first mission, and he's saying, "Look, let's take him again. Let's take John Mark." And you will remember that John Mark left quite early on into that first missionary journey, much to the Apostle Paul's unhappiness. He wasn't happy about that decision at all. He felt that John Mark left him in the lurch. We never give him a reason. There is much speculation that we covered last time as to the reason why he went back home. But Barnabas, the son of encouragement, is wanting to give John Mark a second chance and to have him come on the journey. But Paul, he's saying that's not a good idea. Barnabas wanted to take John, called Mark, along with them also. But Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along, who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. They just couldn't agree on this issue. It says in verse 39, there was such a sharp disagreement between Paul and Barnabas that they separated from one another. So what happens? Well, Barnabas goes with his idea of wanting to take John Mark, and he sails off to Cyprus. They split up. They decide to split up what the plan was going to be. They both agreed it was a good idea to loop back round. Of course, when they did their first missionary journey, they went to Cyprus together. That was Barnabas and Paul. So Barnabas splits up from Paul here, takes John Mark with him and sails away to Cyprus. Of course, that's where we saw Sergius Paulus, do you remember, in Paphos? But the Roman official there who was in charge of keeping everything Roman on the island of Cyprus. That's where Elymas, if you remember, was trying to disrupt the gospel from going forth and to make sure that Sergius Paulus didn't hear the gospel, but he was unsuccessful in trying to distract him from that. If you remember, just to remind you of our previous study in that. So John Mark and Barnabas head off to Cyprus, and then the Apostle Paul chooses Silas, who we heard about yesterday. Now, this is actually the last time now as Barnabas and John Mark head off to Cyprus. They now leave the stage, if you like, according to the account of Acts that Luke wrote to Theophilus. It isn't the end of the friendship. Paul still refers to them in his third missionary journey when he writes to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians, and in Timothy as well, and also mentions John Mark when he writes 2 Timothy to Timothy. So it's not the end of their friendship. It's just they couldn't agree with the logistics of how this was going to work, and Paul didn't, having been let down by John Mark the first time round, didn't want to take that chance again. And of course, you know, there would have been a huge investment of both time and money to do this missionary journey. And I guess once Paul was not convinced that John Mark won't do that again, which is a reason why he didn't want him to be taken. So they separate at this stage. Barnabas and John Mark off to Cyprus, and then Peter chooses Silas. Now, of course, every cloud has a silver lining. Now this means that there are now two ministry teams, doesn't there, spread out. So the Great Commission is going to be furthered, and the Lord would be able to use this situation with his sovereign, power, and being able to lead the steps of both of these two teams. But Paul now chooses Silas, who we're going to be hearing much more of over the next couple of chapters. Silas, we mentioned yesterday, didn't we? He was a Roman citizen by birth, something that would be important later on. Also interesting to notice, Silas came from the Jerusalem church. He was very much connected with Peter. So Silas really is a bridge between Peter and Paul's ministry. And Paul now chosen Silas, who is commissioned alongside Paul by the home church in Antioch. This is what they do, just like they did the first time round. They laid their hands on them and prayed for them. That's what it means here by being committed by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. They were commissioned by the church to send this team out to go off and to check in with how the church plants are doing, and of course to continue to preach and be praying that the Lord would be at work and many more would come to salvation by the hearing of the gospel, by hearing of the word, where the Holy Spirit would be pleased to be at work in doing that and using these two men as tools in God's hand. And as he was traveling through Syria. This is when it says he here, he's talking about Silas and Paul. And he was traveling through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. And of course, that ends Acts chapter 15. It teases up nicely for a brand new chapter in our study tomorrow, where we'll come together, where Timothy will be joining Paul and Silas, and we'll be hearing about this young mentee, this young apprentice from Paul, of course, who we know so much about from the pastoral epistles. Hopefully that's been helpful. If you do have any thoughts, comments or reflections, do let me know in the comments below, and I very much look forward to being with you again tomorrow. Bye for now.